They slept beneath layers of plastic wrap in a forgotten water drainage tunnel, two elderly souls the world had cast aside, surviving on scraps and rainwater, until the night they dug deeper into the frozen earth and uncovered a sealed vault that would reveal $230 million and a secret that had been buried for 60 years. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The November wind cut through Ridgewood, Pennsylvania like a blade, rattling the bare branches and scattering dead leaves across cracked pavement. Most people hurried past the abandoned industrial district on the east side of town, heads down, collars up, pretending not to see what everyone knew was there. But if you looked closely, really looked, you'd notice something strange near the old collapsed water treatment plant. A shelter, barely visible from the road, tucked against the concrete foundation where drainage pipes once carried water into the forgotten building. Two figures moved in the dying light of afternoon. Careful, deliberate, like shadows trying not to be seen. The man was tall but stooped, his frame bent by 73 years of labor and loss. His name was Harold Jennings, and his hands, weathered and scarred, still bore the calluses of a carpenter who'd once built homes for families who would never know his name. Beside him, smaller but no less resilient, was his wife Dorothy. At 70 years old, she moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to carry dignity even when the world stripped everything else away. Their shelter wasn't much. Just layers of heavy plastic sheeting stretched over a framework of salvaged wood and wire, anchored against the concrete wall where an old drainage channel cut into the hillside. Rainwater still trickled through the channel during storms, but Harold had learned to redirect it with carefully placed stones and scavenged metal sheeting. Inside, the space was barely 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The floor was packed dirt, covered with flattened cardboard boxes. Two sleeping bags, both patched with duct tape, lay side by side. A plastic milk crate held their possessions. A dented pot, two mismatched spoons, a bar of soap wrapped in a plastic bag, 3 pairs of socks, and a photograph in a cracked frame. Dorothy knelt beside the makeshift fire pit Harold had constructed from broken bricks, carefully arranging twigs and scraps of paper. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, but she worked patiently, methodically. Patience was all they had left in abundance. "Getting colder," Harold said, his voice rough from years of cigarettes he could no longer afford. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, the zipper, long broken, held closed by a length of rope tied around his waist. Dorothy nodded, blowing gently on the small flame she'd coaxed to life. "Storm coming too. I can smell it." They'd been living here for 8 months now, ever since they'd lost everything. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. The unraveling had been slow, painful, like watching a rope fray one thread at a time, until suddenly there was nothing left to hold on to. First, Harold's construction work had dried up when his knees finally gave out, and he couldn't climb scaffolding anymore. He'd tried to push through the pain, swallowing aspirin by the handful, wrapping his joints in elastic bandages. But bodies have limits, and at 73, his had reached theirs. The younger crews moved faster, complained less, cost less. One day his foreman had pulled him aside with an expression that said everything before words were spoken. "Harold, you've been a good worker, but we gotta let you go." Then Dorothy's job cleaning offices downtown ended when the company went automated. 22 years she'd scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans, and it all ended with a 2-paragraph email and a severance check that barely covered a month's rent. She'd cried for one night, then dried her eyes and started looking for new work. But who hires a 70-year-old woman with a high school education and arthritic hands? The applications went unanswered. The interviews never came. The savings account they'd carefully built over 47 years of marriage evaporated in 6 months. First went the retirement fund, drained to cover living expenses when the paychecks stopped. Then came Dorothy's heart surgery, an emergency triple bypass that saved her life but destroyed their finances. The insurance they had didn't cover half of it. The hospital bills arrived in thick envelopes, numbers so large they stopped feeling real. $147,000. They might as well have asked for the moon. The small apartment they'd rented for 15 years was sold to developers, and the new owners wanted triple the rent. Harold had tried to negotiate, had explained their situation, had begged for more time. The property manager had been polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. You have 60 days to vacate." They'd spent those 60 days frantically searching for anywhere they could afford. But affordable housing had waiting lists 2 years long. Subsidized senior housing was full. Dorothy's sister in Ohio had said she'd help, then stopped returning calls when she realized how much help they actually needed. Harold's son from his first marriage sent a check for $200 once, with a note that said, "This is all I can do. Please don't contact me again." So they ended up here, in a drainage tunnel beneath plastic wrap. 2 people who had worked their entire lives, paid their taxes, raised children, and done everything society asked of them. And now society pretended they didn't exist. Harold sat heavily on an overturned bucket, watching Dorothy tend the small fire. Even here, even now, she moved with purpose. She'd organized their tiny space with the same care she'd once used to arrange their apartment. The sleeping bags were always neatly rolled during the day. The milk crate was positioned just so. She'd even found a small plastic flower at a bus stop and placed it in a dented soup can, a splash of faded pink against the gray plastic walls. It was her way of insisting they were still human, still worthy of beauty, even in this place that felt like the edge of the world. "I walked to the church today," Dorothy said quietly, not looking up from the fire. "Thought maybe they'd have some extra blankets." Harold waited. He knew there was more. Doors were locked. Sign said they're only open Tuesdays and Thursdays for food distribution. Today's Friday. They sat in silence. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the industrial wasteland, a lonely sound that seemed to acknowledge their isolation. "We're going to be okay," Harold said finally, though he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The words had become a ritual, something he said because not saying it felt like giving up entirely. Dorothy looked at him then, her eyes still bright despite everything, still holding that fierce spark. He'd fallen in love with 52 years ago, when she was a waitress at the diner downtown, and he was a young carpenter with more ambition than sense. "I know we are," she said. "We always have been." Their daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of survival. They woke before dawn, before the few people who drove past might see them emerging from their plastic shelter. Harold would venture out first, checking the area, making sure they were still alone. Then Dorothy would follow, and they'd walk the 3 blocks to the gas station on Route 19. The attendant there, a young man named Marcus, who never asked questions, let them use the bathroom. They'd wash up in the small sink. Dorothy carefully combing her gray hair, Harold shaving with a disposable razor he'd found in a dumpster behind a drugstore. Dignity, Dorothy insisted, started with cleanliness. Breakfast, when they had it, came from the community center 4 miles away. They'd walk there, Harold's knees screaming with every step, Dorothy's pace slowing when her heart acted up. The free meal service started at 8 in the morning, and by 7:30 there'd be a line of people just like them, the invisible, the forgotten, the ones who'd fallen through every crack in the safety net. They'd eat oatmeal or scrambled eggs or whatever was being served that day, and they'd be grateful for it even when it was cold or tasteless. Food was food. The rest of the day was spent surviving. Harold collected cans and bottles from roadside ditches, storing them in a garbage bag until he had enough to take to the recycling center for a few dollars. Dorothy sometimes stood outside the grocery store with a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." Some people gave. Most didn't. Some looked at her with pity. Others with contempt. A few teenagers had filmed her once, laughing, posting it online with mocking captions. She'd learned not to make eye contact, not to expect kindness, not to hope for more than loose change. Lunch was usually skipped. Dinner came from whatever they could afford with the day's earnings. Cans of soup bought from the dollar store. Loaves of day-old bread marked down to 50 cents. They'd eat in their shelter, as darkness fell, huddled around their small fire, splitting a can of beans or vegetable soup, making it last, making every bite count. But what sustained them, what kept them from giving up entirely, wasn't food. It was each other. At night, when the cold seeped through the plastic walls and the wind howled across the abandoned lot, they'd lie together in their sleeping bags, Harold's arm around Dorothy, her head on his shoulder. And they'd talk. About the past, about the good years, about the little house they'd rented on Maple Street, with the yellow curtains Dorothy had sewn by hand. About the time Harold had surprised her with a weekend trip to Niagara Falls for their 25th anniversary, the only vacation they'd ever taken. About the grandchildren they rarely saw anymore, grown now with lives too busy to include two elderly people who'd become an embarrassment. "Remember when we bought that old Buick?" Dorothy whispered one night. 1979, I think it was. Thing was already 15 years old, but you were so proud of it. Harold smiled in the darkness. Lasted us another 12 years. I rebuilt that engine twice, changed the transmission in our driveway in the middle of winter. You brought me coffee every hour, with whiskey in it. With whiskey in it, he agreed, laughing softly. Those were good years, Dot. These are hard years, she said. But we're still together. That's what matters. He pulled her closer. Always. The other homeless people they encountered were mostly shadows, ghosts of former lives who appeared and disappeared without leaving names or stories. There was the younger man, maybe 40, who sometimes slept under the bridge half a mile away. He muttered to himself constantly, lost in conversations with people only he could see. There was the woman with 3 children who lived in a rusted van. The kids always quiet, too quiet, their eyes old before their time. There was the veteran with one leg who sat outside the hardware store, his sign reading, "Served my country," now serving time in poverty. They exchanged nods, sometimes shared information about where to find food, or which cops were sympathetic, and which ones would run you off with threats and contempt. But mostly they existed in separate orbits of suffering, too exhausted to build community, too focused on survival to offer much beyond acknowledgement. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was the invisibility. The way people looked through them as if they weren't there. The way conversations stopped when they approached. The assumption that homelessness was a choice, a moral failing, a sign of weakness or addiction, rather than what it usually was. Bad luck? Bad health? bad timing, and a social safety net with holes big enough to swallow entire lives. Dorothy had been a good person her whole life. She'd raised 4 children, volunteered at church, donated to charities when they had money to spare, and now she was the person others crossed the street to avoid. One afternoon, Harold returned to the shelter to find Dorothy sitting with her back against the concrete wall, tears streaming silently down her weathered face. He dropped the bag of cans he'd collected and knelt beside her, his knees protesting. "Dot, what happened?" She shook her head, unable to speak at first. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "A woman at the grocery store told her daughter not to look at me. Said I was what happened when you made bad choices in life. Said she was using me as a lesson." Dorothy looked up at Harold, her eyes red and raw. "I wanted to tell her I made good choices. I worked hard. I loved my family. I did everything right. And I still ended up here." Harold held her while she cried, feeling his own anger rise hot and bitter in his throat. But anger changed nothing. It never had. So he held his wife and let her cry, and whispered the only truth that mattered anymore. "You're a good person, Dorothy Jennings. The best person I've ever known. And anyone who can't see that is the one making bad choices, not you." As November deepened and the temperatures dropped, Harold knew their plastic shelter wouldn't be enough. They'd survive October, barely. They might make it through early November. But when December came with its ice and snow and single-digit temperatures, they'd freeze. He'd seen it happen to other homeless people over the years, heard the stories whispered in food bank lines, found dead in a doorway, died of exposure under a bridge, froze to death in a parking garage. The world moved on. Their names, if anyone bothered to learn them, were forgotten by the next news cycle. He wasn't going to let that happen to Dorothy. Not after 52 years together. Not after everything they'd survived. So he made a decision. The plastic shelter protected them from wind and rain, but not from deep cold. He needed to go deeper, literally, underground, beneath the frost line, where the earth itself provided insulation. He'd build them a dugout, a proper underground shelter that would keep them alive through winter. "I'm going to dig," he announced one evening as they shared a can of soup heated over their small fire. Dorothy looked up from her portion. "Dig. Under the shelter. Create a deeper space. Underground stays warmer in winter. If I can dig down another 3 or 4 feet, make a proper dugout, we'll be protected from the worst of the cold. Maybe even find some dry earth to sleep on instead of this cardboard." "That's a lot of work, Harold. Your back, your knees. My back has gotten me through 73 years. It'll get me through this." His voice was firm, brooking no argument. "I'm not going to let you freeze to death because I was too tired or too sore to dig a hole." Dorothy reached across their small space and took his hand. Her fingers were thin, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but her grip was strong. Then, "I'll help you." He started the next morning with a rusted shovel he'd found weeks earlier in the abandoned water treatment plant. The tool was ancient, the wooden handle cracked and wrapped with duct tape, but it worked. Dorothy helped clear the space inside their shelter, carefully moving their sleeping bags, the milk crate, their few possessions to one corner. They'd dig in the back, where the drainage channel met the concrete foundation. That spot seemed driest, most protected. The first few inches were easy, just packed dirt and small stones loosened by years of water flow and seasonal freezing. Harold worked methodically, testing his limits, stopping when his back spasmed or his knees locked up. Dorothy stayed with him, using a broken piece of metal sheeting to scrape away loose dirt, carrying it outside in their dented pot to dump in piles behind the shelter. It was slow work, exhausting work, but it gave them purpose. For the first time in months, they weren't just surviving, they were building something. By the end of the first day, they'd excavated perhaps 8 inches. Harold's hands were blistered, his shoulders screaming. Dorothy made him stop, boiled water from the drainage channel, and helped him wash. They ate their dinner in silence, too tired for conversation, then collapsed into their sleeping bags and slept the sleep of people who'd earned their rest through honest labor. The second day, Harold dug another 10 inches. The earth was harder now, more compacted, but he persisted. Dorothy worked beside him, and slowly, painfully, the hole deepened. 12 inches, 15, 20. The work took on a rhythm, became almost meditative. Dig, scrape, carry, dig, scrape, carry. The world narrowed to the hole they were creating, to the dream of warmth and safety it represented. On the third day, teenagers found them again. 3 boys, maybe 16 or 17, expensive sneakers and designer jackets, phones in hand. They stood at the edge of the drainage area filming, laughing, making jokes about the old people playing in the dirt like children. One of them asked loudly if this was where homeless people went to die. Another wondered out loud how much the video would get on social media. Harold straightened up slowly, his back protesting. He looked at the boys with an expression that held no anger, just exhaustion and something sadder than rage. "We're just trying to survive the winter," he said quietly. "That's all. We're not hurting anyone." The boys laughed harder at that, the leader zooming in on Harold's face, catching the dirt on his cheeks, the sweat on his brow, the defeat in his eyes. Then they left, already posting their video, already moving on to whatever else teenagers with too much privilege and too little empathy did with their afternoons. Harold stood alone in the hole he'd dug, feeling shame burn through him like acid. Not shame for being homeless, though that was there too. Shame that this was what he'd become. Entertainment for children, a cautionary tale, a joke. Dorothy appeared beside him and took the shovel from his shaking hands. "They don't matter," she said firmly. "Those boys, their opinions, their videos, none of it matters. What matters is this." She gestured at the hole, at their shelter, at the work they were doing to survive. "We matter, you and me, and we're going to make it through winter." Harold looked at his wife, at the fierce determination in her 70-year-old eyes, and felt something shift inside him. She was right. They did matter. Their lives had value. Their love had meaning. Their survival was worth fighting for, regardless of what anyone else thought. He took the shovel back and kept digging. By the end of the first week, the hole was 2 feet deep. By the end of the second week, 3 feet. Harold had to crouch now when he worked, the space getting tighter as he went lower. Dorothy couldn't help as much in the confined space, so she focused on shoring up the walls with scavenged boards from the abandoned plant, creating a rough framework to prevent collapse. They worked without speaking most days, communicating in glances and gestures, the language of a couple who'd been together so long that words were often unnecessary. The hole became their obsession, their project, their reason to keep going. Each inch deeper felt like a victory. Each day they didn't give up felt like defiance. The work was hard, but it was theirs. Nobody was paying them. Nobody was supervising them. Nobody could fire them or evict them from this hole they were digging with their own hands. It belonged to them. This desperate excavation, this last attempt at creating something safe in a world that had offered them nothing but cold indifference. By the time they reached 3.5 feet down, Harold's body was a map of pain. His back seized up most mornings. His knees swelled so badly some nights that Dorothy had to help him out of the hole. His hands, already scarred from decades of construction work, now bore fresh blisters that had burst and healed and burst again. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Winter was coming, and this hole was all that stood between Dorothy and the killing cold of a Pennsylvania December. On the morning of November 23rd, Harold climbed down into the hole for what he thought would be another day of digging. They were close to 4 feet now, deep enough that the space below felt noticeably warmer than above ground. Dorothy had lined the bottom with layers of cardboard and old blankets they'd found behind a thrift store, creating a surprisingly comfortable floor. Harold planned to dig another 6 inches, maybe a foot, then call it done. They'd survived worse. This would be enough. He positioned his shovel and pushed down hard into the earth. The blade struck something solid with a hollow thunk that echoed strangely in the confined space. Not a rock. Rocks made a sharp, definitive sound. This was different. Wooden. Deliberate. Harold froze. His heart began to beat faster, for reasons he couldn't immediately explain. He knelt in the narrow space, brushing dirt away with his hands, feeling for whatever his shovel had hit. His fingers found wood, old wood, dark and weathered but still solid. Planks fitted together with intention, not random debris. This was something built, something constructed, something hidden. Dot, he called up through the entrance of their dugout. Hand me that flashlight. Dorothy passed down the small LED flashlight they'd bought at a dollar store months ago. Their one luxury purchase, kept for emergencies. Harold clicked it on and directed the beam at what he'd uncovered. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just wood. It was a hatch, a door, a sealed panel about 3 feet square, with metal hinges on one side, rusted but intact. And in the center, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated dirt and corrosion, was a metal ring, a handle. "What is it?" Dorothy asked, her voice anxious from above. Harold's hands trembled as he continued brushing dirt away, revealing more of the structure. The wood was fitted precisely, professionally, by someone who knew what they were doing. The hinges were heavy-duty, the kind used for root cellars or storm shelters. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional. Someone had built this, buried it, sealed it, and left it here. "I think," Harold said slowly, his voice strange in his own ears. "I think it's a door." Dorothy climbed down into the dugout, squeezing in beside him in the cramped space. Together, they stared at what Harold had uncovered. She reached out and touched the wood gently, as if it might vanish under her fingers. "How old do you think it is?" "I don't know. Decades at least. Maybe longer. This was here before the water treatment plant, before the drainage system, before everything." He looked at his wife in the dim light of their flashlight. "This is really old, Dot." They worked together to clear the rest of the dirt away from the hatch, exposing the full structure. It was rectangular, about 3 feet by 4 feet. The wood dark with age but remarkably preserved by the dry earth that had protected it. The metal ring handle was corroded but still solid. Harold gripped it and pulled experimentally. Nothing moved. "Should we open it?" Dorothy whispered. Though There was no one around to hear them. Harold considered the question. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to seal it back up, to pretend they'd never found it. Nothing good came from disturbing things that had been buried this long. But another part of him, the part that had dug this hole in the first place, the part that refused to give up, even when everything else had been stripped away, that part wanted to know, needed to know. What was down there? Why had it been sealed? Who had built it? And underneath all those questions was one more, barely acknowledged. Could it help them? Could whatever was buried beneath this hatch be the answer to prayers they'd stopped saying, because God seemed to have stopped listening? Yes, he said finally. We open it. He positioned himself to get better leverage, planting his feet on the uneven earthen floor of their dugout. Dorothy moved beside him, adding her hands to his on the metal ring. Together they pulled. At first, nothing happened. The wood was swollen with time, the hinges frozen with rust and earth. Harold's back screamed in protest. Dorothy's arthritic hands couldn't grip properly. But they didn't stop. They pulled harder, putting their combined weight into it. All the strength built from 52 years of marriage and 8 months of surviving the unsurvivable. Something gave. A crack, sharp and loud, in the underground darkness. The seal broke. Air, old air, ancient air, rushed out from below with a sound like a sigh, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath for decades. The hatch lifted an inch, then 2. Then it swung open suddenly, the rusted hinges screaming, and revealed what lay beneath. Stone steps, rough-hewn stone steps descending into deeper darkness. The beam from Harold's flashlight couldn't reach the bottom, just illuminated the first few steps before being swallowed by shadow. But what little they could see was enough to know this wasn't just an old root cellar or storm shelter. The steps were too carefully constructed, too deliberately placed. The walls on either side were brick, old handmade brick that must have been laid a century ago or more. This was something significant, something important, something that someone had gone to great lengths to hide and preserve. Harold and Dorothy knelt at the edge of the opening, staring down into darkness that seemed to pulse with possibility and danger in equal measure. The smell rising from below wasn't decay or rot like Harold had feared. It was dry air, old paper, metal, the scent of time sealed away and preserved. His hands shook as he shone the flashlight down the stairs, trying to count the steps. 8. Maybe 10. Then the beam faded into blackness. 4s. 4s. A 1. Harold. Dorothy breathed beside him. What is this place? He shook his head slowly, unable to answer because he didn't know, couldn't know, not yet. But something deep in his chest told him that whatever lay at the bottom of those stone steps, hidden beneath the abandoned industrial district where 2 homeless people had built a shelter from plastic wrap, was about to change everything. They had been digging for warmth, for shelter, for a way to survive one more winter. But they'd found something else. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than either of them had been alive. Something that someone had hidden with great care and deliberate intention. Something that was now theirs to discover. Harold looked at Dorothy. Her face was pale in the flashlight's glow, her eyes wide with fear and wonder in equal measure. After 52 years, he could read every expression, every emotion, and what he saw now mirrored what he felt. Terror at the unknown, hope for the impossible, and the unshakable sense that they stood at a threshold between the life they'd been living and something entirely different. "We go down," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Dorothy nodded slowly. "We go down." Harold tested the first stone step carefully, putting just a little weight on it, ready to pull back if it crumbled. But the stone held firm, solid as the day it had been set. He placed his full weight on it. Still solid. He descended to the second step, then the third, the flashlight beam preceding him into the darkness below. Dorothy followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder for balance, trusting him to lead them safely into whatever secrets lay buried beneath their feet. The air grew cooler as they descended, but not cold, dry and still, preserved by being sealed away from weather and time. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center, evidence that people had walked this path before. Many people, many times, long ago. 8 steps down, 9, 10, and then Harold's foot found level ground. He was standing at the bottom, in a chamber, his flashlight beam sweeping across darkness that seemed to retreat before it. He took one more step forward, Dorothy emerging beside him, and together they looked around at what they'd found. The chamber was large, perhaps 15 feet square, with an arched brick ceiling that rose to maybe 8 feet at its highest point. And along every wall, stacked carefully, methodically, deliberately, were containers, wooden crates with rope handles, metal boxes with heavy latches, canvas bags tied with cord, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all arranged with precision, preserved with care, waiting in the darkness for someone to find them. In the center of the room sat a wooden table, simple but solid, and on that table, caught in the beam of Harold's trembling flashlight, was a leather satchel. Next to it, protected by a glass frame, was a piece of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. Writing covered the page in careful script, and at the bottom, a signature. Harold and Dorothy stood frozen at the bottom of the stone steps, in a vault that shouldn't exist, surrounded by mystery their exhausted minds couldn't yet process. They had been looking for shelter. They had found something else entirely. Something that would change not just their lives, but their understanding of what was possible when desperation drove you to dig deeper than anyone should have to dig. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for them, for anyone desperate enough to need it, for anyone who had lost everything and had nothing left but the strength to keep digging. Something that would transform 2 invisible souls into something the world could no longer ignore. Harold took Dorothy's hand in the darkness. Both of them were shaking. Neither could speak. They just stood there, holding each other, staring at the vault that had been buried beneath their feet all along. And in that moment of discovery, in that underground chamber where time had stopped and secrets had been kept, Harold Jennings understood with perfect clarity that their lives would never be the same again. For better or worse, for blessing or curse, they had found what they'd been digging for. For blessing or curse, for blessing or curse, and it had been waiting for them all along. Harold's flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a question mark, illuminating dust particles that hung suspended in air that hadn't moved in decades. He took another step into the chamber, his boots finding solid brick floor beneath the accumulated dust. Dorothy remained close behind him, her breathing shallow and quick in the confined space. The wooden table sat in the center of the room like an altar, and Harold moved toward it slowly, reverently, as if approaching something sacred. The leather satchel was brown, cracked with age but intact. The glass frame protecting the note caught the light and held it, making the yellowed paper inside seem to glow. "Read it," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please read it." Harold set the flashlight on the table, angling it so the beam illuminated the framed note. He lifted the frame carefully, half expecting it to crumble in his hands. But the glass was thick, protective, and the document inside had been preserved perfectly. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice cracking on the first few words. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and this vault has remained hidden as I intended. I made my fortune through hard work and luck, but I lost my family through greed and pride. By the time I understood what mattered, it was too late. Harold paused, his hands shaking so badly that the frame rattled softly. Dorothy moved closer, steadying his grip with her own hands, and together they held the note, while Harold continued reading. So I am leaving this here, buried beneath the land where I once built my first factory, before the world knew my name. If you have found this place, if you are desperate enough to dig this deep, then perhaps you need this more than my children ever will. They have their own fortunes now. They do not need mine. Use it wisely. Use it with love. And perhaps do what I failed to do. Build something that lasts longer than money. Build something that matters. The signature at the bottom was written in a shakier hand, as if age or emotion had affected the writer's control. Signed, James Robert Pemberton. November 12, 1947. The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the underground chamber. Harold set the frame back on the table with exaggerated care, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment. He turned slowly, shining his flashlight around the room, really seeing it now for the first time. The wooden crates were stacked 3 and 4 high along the north wall. Military-style containers, the kind used for ammunition or supplies during the war years. Harold moved to the nearest stack and carefully examined the latches. They were locked, but not rusted, preserved by the dry air. He looked around for something to pry them open with, and spotted a crowbar leaning against the far wall, placed there deliberately, waiting. He left tools, Harold murmured, retrieving the crowbar. He positioned the crowbar under the first crate's lid and applied pressure. The wood creaked in protest, nails groaning as they released their decades-long grip. The lid lifted. Harold set it aside and reached into the crate, pulling back layers of oilcloth that had protected the contents. Paper. Stacks and stacks of paper. But not just any paper. Currency. Bills bundled with rubber bands that had long since deteriorated into sticky residue. Harold lifted one bundle into the light. $20 bills, old design, from the 1940s, all of them pristine, uncirculated, preserved as perfectly as the day they'd been sealed away. He couldn't breathe, literally could not draw air into his lungs. Dorothy made a sound beside him, something between a gasp and a sob. Harold set the bundle on the table and opened another crate. More money. This time, $50 bills, and another, $100 bills, bound in neat stacks. Harold, Dorothy whispered. How much is here? He shook his head, unable to answer, unable to process. He moved to the metal boxes next. These were heavier, sealed with combination locks that had been left open, the numbers still visible. 1947. The year of the note. He opened the first metal box, and the flashlight beam caught on something that made his heart stop. Gold. Gold coins stacked in rolls, gleaming in the darkness like captured sunlight. American eagles, double eagles, coins that predated the vault by decades. Harold had done enough construction work in old houses to recognize valuable antiques when he saw them. These weren't just gold. These were collectibles, rare pieces worth far more than their metal content. He opened another metal box. More gold. And another. Bars this time. Small ingots stamped with assay marks and dates. One read, Pemberton Steel Works, 1943. The man had cast his own gold into bars using his factory's stamp. Dorothy sank onto the brick floor, her legs simply giving out beneath her. Harold knelt beside her, the flashlight now resting on the ground, sending wild shadows across the curved ceiling. They stared at each other in the dim light. Two homeless people in an underground vault, surrounded by more wealth than they could comprehend. "This isn't real," Dorothy said flatly. "We're dreaming. Or we've died. We froze to death in the shelter. And this is heaven, or hell, or some kind of hallucination." Harold reached out and pinched her arm gently. She yelped. "You felt that? Yes. Then we're not dead." He looked around at the stacked containers they hadn't even begun to explore. "This is real, Dot. It's actually real." He forced himself to stand. Forced his shaking legs to carry him to the canvas bags lined against the east wall. These were tied with cord that crumbled at his touch, the fabric brittle with age. He opened the first bag carefully. Inside were folders, document sleeves, papers, sealed in wax paper. He pulled out the first sleeve and tilted it toward the light. Bearer bonds. He'd heard of them but never seen one. Old financial instruments, essentially cash in paper form, worth their face value to whoever held them. The first one he examined was for $10,000, dated 1946. He checked another folder. More bonds. These, for $25,000 each. A third folder held bonds for $50,000 apiece. "There are dozens of these bags," he said, his voice strange and distant in his own ears. "Dozens." Dot. She'd crawled to the table and was sitting beneath it now, her back against one of the legs, arms wrapped around her knees like a child. Who was he, this Pemberton man? Who was he that he could hide this much? Harold searched his memory. The name was familiar, tickling at the edges of recognition. "Pemberton," he repeated slowly. "James Robert Pemberton." Then it clicked. The Steel Baron. He owned half of western Pennsylvania in the 1940s. Built factories. Employed thousands. I remember reading about him when I was younger. He died in the 50s, I think. Richest man in the state. Maybe in the whole Northeast. 7. Rista stations. House support. And he hid all this. Dorothy gestured weakly at the vault. Why? Why not just give it to his family? Harold picked up the framed note again and reread it, this time paying attention to the words between the words. "Lost my family through greed and pride. Understood too late what mattered. The children have their own fortunes." He had a falling out with them, Harold said quietly. Made his money, but it cost him his relationships. By the time he wanted to make it right, they didn't need him anymore, didn't want his money, so he buried it here, in the place where he started, and left it for someone who actually needed it. "Someone like us," Dorothy whispered. "Someone exactly like us." They spent the next hour exploring the vault with the systematic attention of people who needed to understand the magnitude of what they'd found. Harold kept mental notes, tried to count, tried to estimate. 32 wooden crates, most filled with currency. 18 metal boxes, all containing either gold coins or bars. 27 canvas bags holding bearer bonds, and what appeared to be stock certificates from companies long since absorbed or dissolved. And in one corner, almost as an afterthought, a stack of metal file boxes containing deeds, property records, and legal documents. When they finally climbed back up the stone steps into their dugout, The sky outside their plastic shelter had darkened to full night. Neither of them had noticed time passing. Harold sealed the hatch carefully, covering it with dirt, making it invisible again. They sat in their shelter. The small fire Dorothy had started hours ago now just embers, and tried to process what they'd discovered. "We can't tell anyone," Harold said finally. It was the first coherent thought he'd had since reading Pemberton's note. "Harold, not yet. Not until we figure this out." He ran his hands through his thinning hair, a gesture of stress he'd been making for 50 years. "If we tell people, if anyone finds out, we lose everything. They'll say it's not ours. They'll say we were trespassing. They'll say we stole it. They'll take it all, and we'll end up right back here with nothing." Dorothy pulled her threadbare jacket tighter against the cold. "But it's not ours. It belonged to someone. To this Pemberton man and his family. He's been dead for probably 50 years or more. He left a note. He meant for someone to find it. Someone who needed it." Harold looked at his wife, at her weathered face and exhausted eyes, at the woman who had stood beside him through everything, who had never complained even when they lost it all, who had organized a shelter made of plastic wrap like it was a real home because dignity came from inside. "And you think that someone is us? I think we've been sleeping on cardboard, eating from soup kitchens, and begging for change for 8 months. I think we dug that hole because we were desperate to survive winter. I think that's exactly what his note said. If you're desperate enough to dig this deep." Harold's voice broke. "We're desperate, Dorothy. We've been desperate for a long time." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "So what do? We sleep on it. Tomorrow we figure out our next move. But tonight, we don't tell anyone. We don't change anything. We stay invisible a little longer." But Harold didn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag, Dorothy curled against him, and his mind raced through scenarios. What if someone had seen them digging? What if those teenagers who'd filmed them came back? What if the property owner discovered them before they could figure out what to do? And underneath all that fear ran a deeper current. What if they couldn't handle it? What if this fortune that had fallen into their laps destroyed them the way fortunes had destroyed plenty of others? He must have dozed eventually because, when he opened his eyes, grey dawn light was filtering through the plastic walls. Dorothy was already awake, sitting cross-legged with the cracked photograph from their milk crate in her hands. The picture showed them on their wedding day 52 years ago, both young and smiling and full of hope they hadn't yet learned to temper. "I've been thinking," she said without looking up, "about what you said last night, about not telling anyone." Harold sat up, his back protesting every movement. "And bye, and you're wrong." She finally met his eyes. "We need help, professional help, a lawyer, someone who can tell us what to do, how to do this legally, how to keep it without losing it all. We can't afford a lawyer." Dorothy gave him a look that would have been withering if it wasn't so gentle. "Harold," he almost laughed. She was right. They couldn't afford a lawyer yet. But once they tried to do anything with what they'd found, once they tried to claim it, or use it, or even just report it, they'd need legal help. Good, legal help. The kind that didn't come cheap. "There was a guy I used to work with," Harold said slowly, "back when I did construction on the courthouse renovation. Danny Morrison. He wasn't a contractor. He was a lawyer, but he did pro bono work sometimes, helped people who couldn't afford legal fees. Came from nothing himself, worked his way through law school. Good man. Honest. You think he'd help us?" "I think he'd at least listen." Harold pulled himself to his feet, joints crackling. "I'll go see him today. Today." "Harold, you're exhausted. You barely slept. Neither did you." He looked down at his wife, at the photograph still clutched in her arthritic hands. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. If someone else discovers that vault, if anyone figures out what's down there before we can protect it legally, we lose our chance." Dorothy stood and placed the photograph carefully back in the milk crate. "Then we go together." They walked the 3 miles to the public library, Harold's knees screaming with every step, Dorothy stopping twice to catch her breath when her heart acted up. At the library, they used one of the public computers to search for Daniel Morrison, attorney at law. Harold's hands left dirty smudges on the keyboard despite their morning wash at the gas station. He found Danny still practicing in Ridgewood, now a senior partner at Morrison & Chen law firm. The address was downtown in one of those glass and steel buildings that looked like it cost more per month in rent than Harold had made in a year. Harold wrote down the address on a scrap of paper, and they walked back out into the cold November morning. It took another 40 minutes to reach the office building. With each step, Harold's courage faded a little more. What was he thinking? He couldn't just walk into a fancy law office looking like a homeless man and ask for help with a $200 million problem. They'd throw him out. They'd call security. Danny probably wouldn't even remember him. They stood outside the building for a long time, Dorothy holding Harold's hand, neither speaking. Then Dorothy squeezed his fingers and said simply, "If you don't try, we'll never know." That side, that's face tried too. That's Saul Pani. The lobby was everything Harold had feared. Polished marble floors, expensive furniture, the smell of money and power, and people who mattered. The receptionist looked up from her desk, her professional smile faltering slightly when she saw them. Harold could see her assessment, could read her thoughts in the subtle shift of her expression. Homeless, confused, possibly dangerous. "Should I call security? Can I help you?" Her tone was polite but wary, the voice of someone trained to handle uncomfortable situations with minimum disruption. "I need to see Daniel Morrison." "Danny Morrison. We used to work together about 20 years ago." Harold's voice came out rougher than he intended, made harsh by cold nights and too much time in silence. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm sorry. Mr. Morrison is very busy. If you'd like to make an appointment, I can schedule something for next month." Next month might as well be next century. Harold started to argue, started to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain any of this to a receptionist who looked at him like he might steal the fancy pens from her desk? "It's important," he said finally, quietly, hating how weak he sounded. The receptionist's expression softened slightly. "I understand, sir. But without an appointment, let him in, Marie." They both turned. A man stood in the doorway to the inner offices, maybe mid-50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the entire contents of Harold's old apartment. But his face had the kind of lines that came from real work in younger years, and his eyes were widening with recognition. Harold Jennings. Harold felt something loosen in his chest. "Hey, Danny." Daniel Morrison crossed the lobby in 3 strides and gripped Harold's hand. "My God, man, I heard you'd fallen on hard times, but I didn't know how to find you. Come in, please, come in." He led them through a maze of offices and conference rooms to a corner office with a view of downtown Ridgewood. The furniture was leather. The carpet was thick. Harold felt like he was leaving dirty footprints with every step. tracking poverty into this pristine space. "Sit, please," Danny said, gesturing to chairs that looked more expensive than anything Harold had ever owned. Then he took a good look at Harold in the better light. Really looked at him, and his expression changed to something between shock and sorrow. "Jesus, Harold, what happened to you?" So Harold told him. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He told him about losing work, about Dorothy's medical bills, about the eviction and the failed attempts to find help. He told him about the plastic shelter and the drainage tunnel, and the decision to dig deeper to survive winter. Dorothy sat silent beside him, hands folded in her lap, listening to her husband narrate their descent into homelessness with a kind of detached precision, as if he was describing someone else's life. "We're living underground now," Harold said, not meeting Danny's eyes. "In a hole we dug ourselves, like animals, like we're not even people anymore." Danny said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to his door, and called out to his secretary. "Hold all my calls. Cancel everything today. I'm not available." He closed the door, returned to his desk, and looked at Harold. "Tell me everything, and I mean everything. Whatever it is you're really here about, whatever you're afraid to say, just say it." So Harold did. He told him about the wooden hatch, about the stone steps and the brick chamber, about the containers and the money and the gold and the bearer bonds. He pulled out the scrap of paper where he'd written down details from Pemberton's note, the signature, the date, the message about using it with love. His hands shook as he laid it on Danny's expensive desk, leaving smudges on the polished wood. Danny listened without interrupting. His expression never changed, but Harold could see his lawyer's mind working behind his eyes, calculating, analyzing, searching for angles and problems and solutions. When Harold finished, Danny leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said, "that's not what I expected to hear today. You think I'm crazy. No, actually, I believe you. Pemberton was real. He was one of the richest men in Pennsylvania in the 40s. Died in 1953, I think. Left most of his fortune to his children, who promptly spent the next decade in court fighting over the estate. There were rumors he'd hidden some of his wealth, but nothing was ever found." Danny paused. Until now, Harold agreed quietly. Danny stood and walked to his window, looking out over the city. "The question is, what do we do about it? Can I keep it? Legally, I mean. If I found it on property I'm squatting on, if it's been buried for 70+ years, if the man who hid it is dead." "It's complicated," Danny interrupted. "Very complicated. First, we need to determine legal ownership of the land you're on. If it's public property or privately owned by someone else, that affects your claim. Second, we need to establish whether Pemberton's heirs have any legal right to the contents of that vault. Third, we need to determine the actual value of what you found. And fourth, we need to do all of this without you getting arrested for trespassing or accused of theft." Harold's heart sank. "So, I can't keep it." "I didn't say that." Danny turned back to face him. "I said it's complicated. But Harold, if we do this right, if we document everything properly, if we're transparent with the authorities and follow the letter of the law, there's a very good chance that vault and everything in it legally belongs to you under finder's law and abandonment statutes. There's a law for this. There are laws for everything. The question is whether we can navigate them without losing it all to legal fees and government seizure in the process. Danny returned to his desk and sat down. I'll take your case. Pro bono. For old time's sake, and because this is the most interesting thing to cross my desk in 10 years. Harold felt tears burning in his eyes. You'll help us? I'll help you. But Harold, you need to understand something. Once we start this process, once we report the find and go through legal channels, your life is going to become very complicated, very quickly. The press will find out. People will want interviews. Every person claiming to be related to Pemberton will come out of the woodwork. You and Dorothy will need protection, both legal and physical. We're homeless, Danny. We've already got nothing to lose. That's where you're wrong, Danny said quietly. You've got everything to lose now. $230 million of everything. Give or take. Harold blinked. What? Rough estimate. Based on what you've described, could be more, could be slightly less, depending on market conditions and authentication. But we're definitely talking 9 figures. Danny leaned forward. That kind of money changes people, Harold. It corrupts. It destroys. I've seen it happen to clients who won big lawsuits or got major settlements. People who were decent and humble before suddenly became different when the money arrived. We're not like that. Maybe not. But the world is. And the world is going to come at you hard once this gets out. He stood again, this time with purpose. So here's what we're going to do. First, you're going to take me to this shelter of yours. I need to see the vault, document it, photograph everything before we touch another thing or move forward. Second, we're going to file papers with the court establishing your claim as finders. Third, we're going to get you and Dorothy into a hotel tonight. A nice one, with room service and hot water, and real beds. We can't afford. I can. Consider it an advance on services rendered. And Harold, Danny's voice softened, you're not sleeping in a plastic shelter another night. Not if I have anything to say about it. Harold felt his throat close up. He tried to speak and couldn't. Dorothy reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. Finally, Harold managed to whisper, "Why are you doing this?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "You remember that summer I worked construction with you? 1998, I think it was. Right after I graduated law school. I was broke, waiting to take the bar exam, sleeping on my sister's couch. You gave me a job, even though I didn't know a hammer from a wrench. You were a hard worker. You paid me double what the job was worth because you knew I was struggling. You never said anything, just put extra in the envelope every Friday. And when I passed the bar and told you I was leaving, you took me out for a steak dinner I know you couldn't afford and said you were proud of me." Danny's eyes were bright. "You treated me like I mattered when I was nobody. So yeah, I'm helping you, because that's what decent people do for each other." They drove to the industrial district in Danny's BMW. An absurd contrast to the abandoned buildings and broken pavement. Harold directed him to the drainage tunnel, where their plastic shelter rippled in the cold wind. Dorothy had stayed quiet during the drive, but now she gripped Harold's arm tightly. "This is it," she said unnecessarily. "This is where we've been living." Danny parked and stepped out, his expensive shoes crunching on gravel and broken glass. He looked at the plastic shelter, at the drainage channel, at the utter poverty and desperation of the place. His expression never changed, but Harold saw him swallow hard. "Show me," Danny said simply. They took him down into the dugout, through the narrow entrance that Danny had to squeeze through sideways. His suit jacket caught on rough wood, and tore slightly. He didn't seem to notice. They showed him the hatch, and Harold opened it again, revealing the stone steps leading down into darkness. Danny descended carefully, one hand on the brick wall for balance. Harold and Dorothy followed with the flashlight. At the bottom, Danny stood in the center of the chamber, speechless, turning slowly to take in the stacked containers and crates. "My God," he finally whispered. "You weren't exaggerating. If anything, you understated it." He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs. Dozens of them, documenting every angle, every detail. He photographed Pemberton's note through its protective glass, careful not to touch it. He documented the crates, the metal boxes, the canvas bags. He took measurements of the chamber itself, noting the brick construction and stone steps. When he finally climbed back up into the dugout, his expression was grim. "Okay," he said. "Here's what happens next. Tonight, you two are coming to a hotel. No arguments. Tomorrow morning, we file papers with the county clerk establishing your claim. By tomorrow afternoon, we'll need to have reported this to the police, and possibly the FBI, given the age and value of the find. Within 48 hours, this place will be crawling with investigators, historians, lawyers, and probably the IRS." "The IRS?" Dorothy asked, weakly. "This is technically income. Found money. You'll owe taxes on it if the claim goes through." Harold did some quick math in his head. "How much? How much? Federal and state combined?" "Probably 37 to 40% of the total value," Dorothy gasped. That's about $90 million, Danny said, "which still leaves you with around $140 million, give or take." 7. The silence that followed was profound. Harold and Dorothy stood in their underground shelter, the plastic walls rustling above them, and tried to comprehend numbers that felt more like abstract concepts than real money. "I can't," Dorothy finally said, her voice barely audible. "I can't process this. It's too much. It's too big." Harold pulled her close. "We don't have to process it all at once. We just take it one step at a time. Right, Danny?" "Right," Danny agreed. "Starting with getting you two somewhere warm and safe. Pack up your things, everything you want to keep." They looked around the shelter that had been their home for 8 months. At the sleeping bags and the milk crate and the plastic flour in the soup can. At the cardboard floor and the plastic walls and the small fire pit that had kept them from freezing. "There's not much to take," Harold said quietly, but Dorothy picked up the cracked photograph from the milk crate. The one showing her and Harold on their wedding day 52 years ago, both of them young and smiling and full of hope. "We take this," she said. "Everything else, we leave behind." That night, Harold and Dorothy Jennings checked into the Ridgewood Grand Hotel under names provided by Danny Morrison for security purposes. The room had a king-size bed with sheets so soft Dorothy cried when she touched them. There was a bathroom with hot water that didn't run out, didn't turn cold after 30 seconds, didn't require them to wash in a gas station sink. There was a television and air conditioning and a mini fridge stocked with food they didn't have to forage for or buy with recycled bottle money. They stood in the center of the room, holding hands, not speaking. The contrast between this morning and this evening felt impossible to bridge. This morning they'd woken on cardboard in a hole they'd dug themselves. Tonight they stood in luxury they couldn't afford but might soon own outright. Dorothy walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower. She stood under the hot water fully clothed at first, as if she'd forgotten she could take the dirty clothes off. Harold followed her in, still in his own stained jacket and worn jeans, and they stood together under the spray until the water ran clear, washing away 8 months of accumulated dirt and shame and exhaustion. Harold helped Dorothy out of her wet clothes and dried her gently with the hotel's plush towels. He wrapped her in one of the thick bathrobes hanging on the door and led her to the bed. She was asleep before her head fully settled on the pillow, her breathing evening out almost immediately, her body finally able to rest without fear of cold or danger. Harold sat in a chair by the window, looking out over the city lights of Ridgewood. Somewhere out there was the industrial district, the drainage tunnel, the plastic shelter, and beneath it all, a vault containing more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. His phone, a cheap burner phone Danny had given him earlier, buzzed with a text message. Papers filed. Everything set in motion. Get some rest. Tomorrow changes everything. Harold read the message 3 times. Then he turned off the phone and walked to the bed. He lay down beside Dorothy carefully, so as not to wake her. In sleep, she looked younger, the lines of worry and hardship smoothed away by exhaustion, and the first real rest she'd had in months. "I love you, Dot," he whispered into the darkness. "No matter what happens next, no matter how crazy things get, I want you to know that. None of this matters if I don't have you." She stirred slightly, her hand finding his even in sleep. "I know," she murmured without waking. "I've always known." And in that expensive hotel room, with its soft sheets and hot water, and security that came from walls instead of plastic wrap, 2 elderly souls who had survived 8 months of homelessness finally slept the sleep of people who had found not just potential wealth, but hope, real hope. The kind that came from knowing they weren't alone anymore, that someone was fighting for them, that maybe, just maybe, the universe had finally decided they'd suffered enough. Tomorrow would bring complications and challenges beyond imagining. Tomorrow the world would learn their story, and everyone would have opinions about what they deserved or didn't deserve. Tomorrow lawyers and investigators and journalists would descend on their lives with questions and cameras and judgments. But tonight, they had this moment, this room, this bed, each other. And for 2 people who had spent the last 8 months with nothing, who had dug into frozen earth hoping only to survive one more winter, who had found something they never expected in the darkness beneath their feet, tonight was enough. Tonight was more than enough. It was everything. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but by 8 o'clock, news vans had already filled the parking lot outside Morrison and Chen law firm. Word had leaked somehow. It always did. And by the time Harold and Dorothy arrived through a side entrance in Danny's BMW, the crowd had swelled to include not just journalists but curious onlookers, skeptics with homemade signs, and at least 3 people claiming to be distant relatives of James Robert Pemberton. Dorothy gripped Harold's hand so tightly in the elevator that his fingers went numb. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps. "I can't do this," she whispered, staring at the elevator doors like they were prison bars closing in. "Harold, I can't stand up there in front of all those people." "You don't have to say anything," he assured her, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "Danny will do the talking. We just have to be there. Just be present." But he understood her fear. In the past 24 hours, their lives had been turned inside out. Yesterday morning, they'd woken in a plastic shelter, invisible to the world. Yesterday evening, they'd slept in a hotel room with sheets softer than clouds. And now, this morning, they were about to become the center of a media storm that would either lift them up or tear them apart. The conference room was packed wall to wall with bodies and equipment. Cameras and microphones created a forest of metal and plastic at the front of the room, reporters jostling for position, producers shouting last-minute instructions into headsets. Harold and Dorothy sat at a long table with Danny between them, feeling exposed under lights brighter than any they'd worked under, brighter than the sun. Danny stepped to the podium and adjusted the microphone. The room fell silent, that expectant hush that precedes revelation. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and professional. "On November 23rd, my clients, Harold and Dorothy Jennings, made a remarkable discovery while seeking shelter on what they believed to be abandoned property in the industrial district of Ridgewood. While digging to improve their living conditions during approaching winter, they uncovered a sealed underground vault containing what appears to be a significant collection of currency, precious metals, and financial instruments dating from the 1940s. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Cameras flashed, creating bursts of light that made Dorothy flinch. Preliminary assessment suggests the contents are authentic and may be connected to James Robert Pemberton, the industrialist who owned significant property in this area during that era. We have filed appropriate claims with the county and are cooperating fully with law enforcement and historical preservation authorities," a reporter shouted from the back, his voice cutting through the murmur. "How much is it worth?" Danny paused for effect. "We're awaiting professional appraisal, but early estimates suggest the total value may exceed $200 million. The room erupted. Reporters shouted over each other, questions overlapping into incomprehensible noise. Someone demanded to know why homeless people should keep that much money. Someone else wanted to know if this was an elaborate hoax. A third voice accused them of stealing from a historical estate. The chaos felt physical. Pressing in from all sides, Danny held up his hand, waiting for quiet. "My clients will take a limited number of questions." A woman in the front row stood, notebook in hand, press credentials hanging from her neck. "Mrs. Jennings, how does it feel to go from homeless to potentially one of the richest people in Pennsylvania?" Dorothy looked at Harold. He nodded encouragement. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice trembling. "I don't feel rich," she said quietly. "I feel scared and confused and grateful that someone is helping us. We didn't go looking for treasure. We were just trying to survive winter. We were trying not to freeze to death." "Mr. Jennings," another reporter, aggressive, pushing forward, "what will you do with the money if your claim goes through?" Harold considered the question carefully. He thought about all the nights in the plastic shelter, all the people they'd met at food banks and community centers, all the invisible souls society had forgotten. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know we won't forget where we came from. We won't forget what it's like to have nothing. We won't forget the people who are still out there." The questions continued, rapid fire and increasingly hostile. Someone wanted to know why they hadn't immediately reported the find to authorities. Someone questioned whether they'd actually been homeless, or if this was all staged for publicity. A man in the back shouted that the money rightfully belonged to the Pemberton estate, that finders keepers wasn't how the law worked, that they were thieves dressed up as victims. Danny fielded what he could, redirecting, clarifying, protecting his clients from the worst of it. But the mood in the room had shifted. This wasn't just a human interest story anymore. This was controversy. This was conflict. This was the kind of story that sold newspapers and generated clicks and gave people something to argue about over dinner. Finally, after 30 minutes that felt like hours, Danny ended the press conference. "That's all the questions we're taking today. Thank you for your time." They escaped through a back corridor, But even there they could hear the crowd outside the building. Harold caught a glimpse through a window and stopped cold. Hundreds of people, maybe more, filled the street. Some held signs that read, "Give it back." Others said, "God bless you." One large banner declared, "Fake news hoax." Another said, "Heroes of the forgotten. This is insane." Dorothy whispered, pressing close to Harold's side. "It's going to get worse," Danny warned, guiding them toward his car in the underground garage. "I've already had 3 different law firms call representing alleged Pemberton descendants. The State Attorney General's office wants a meeting. And there are people, Harold, people who aren't friendly, who are trying to find out where you're staying." "What kind of people?" Danny's expression was grim. "The kind who think $200 million is worth doing bad things for." Over the next 2 weeks, Harold and Dorothy experienced what it meant to live in the public eye. Despite Danny's best efforts to keep their hotel location confidential, reporters tracked them down. Someone leaked their room number online. People recognized them from news coverage and approached them everywhere, at grocery stores, on sidewalks, in restaurant bathrooms. Some wanted autographs as if they were celebrities. Others wanted money, sob stories about sick children, or mounting debts, or dreams deferred. Many just wanted to touch them, as if proximity to sudden fortune might be contagious, might rub off like fairy dust. The scrutiny was intense and often cruel. Online commentators debated whether homeless people deserved that much money. Financial advisors they'd never met offered unsolicited advice about investments and trusts. Self-proclaimed experts went on television to explain why the Jennings were either brilliant or foolish, deserving or opportunistic, victims or con artists. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone knew exactly what Harold and Dorothy should do with money they didn't yet have and might never receive. The legal battles began almost immediately. 3 days after the press conference, a law firm from Philadelphia filed papers on behalf of Margaret Pemberton Collins, James Pemberton's alleged great-granddaughter, claiming that the vault's contents were part of the original Pemberton estate, and therefore belonged to his legal heirs. 2 days later, another firm filed similar papers for Thomas Pemberton, who claimed to be a great-great-grandson through an illegitimate line. A third claimant emerged from California, presenting genealogy documents of questionable authenticity. The IRS opened an investigation into Harold and Dorothy's finances, past and present, looking for any angle to maximize tax revenue. They requested decades of records the couple no longer had, documents lost in the eviction, papers that had seemed unimportant when they were just trying to survive. The agent assigned to their case was polite but relentless, explaining that found treasure was taxable income, that failure to properly report it could result in criminal charges, that ignorance of the law was not a defense. Property disputes arose over the land where the vault had been found. The city claimed the industrial district belonged to them through tax forfeiture decades earlier. A development company produced documents suggesting they'd purchased the property in the early 2000s, but had never developed it. Even the descendants of the original landowner from the 1800s appeared, arguing that mineral rights and treasure trove discoveries fell under their purview. Through it all, Harold and Dorothy lived in a strange limbo between poverty and potential wealth. Danny's trust fund gave them enough to rent a modest apartment on the edge of town and buy groceries, but they were essentially living on charity, waiting for a legal system to decide their fate. The apartment had heat and running water and a real bed, luxuries they'd lived without for 8 months. After sleeping under plastic wrap, it should have felt like a palace, but it didn't. It felt like a waiting room, a place between worlds. "I miss the shelter," Dorothy said, one night, 3 weeks after the press conference. She was lying in their new bed that felt too soft, too empty of purpose. "Is that crazy? To miss sleeping on cardboard?" Harold turned to look at her in the darkness. "The plastic shelter? The one where we froze and starved? At least we knew where we stood there. We were poor, but it was our poor. This?" She gestured at the apartment around them. "We're living in someone else's generosity, waiting for someone else to decide if we get to be rich or if they take it all away. We don't know who we are anymore." He understood completely. The uncertainty was its own kind of poverty. They'd gone from having nothing to potentially having everything, but the potential was somehow worse than the nothing had been. At least with nothing, you knew what you had. You could plan around it, adapt to it, survive it. But this suspended state, this maybe rich, maybe not, maybe tomorrow, maybe never, it was exhausting in ways that cold and hunger had never been. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. 3 months after the discovery, Danny called with news that made Harold's stomach drop. "We've got a hearing scheduled. Judge Margaret Warren is presiding. She's fair, by the book, not easily swayed by media attention or political pressure. This is good for us." When? 2 weeks, February 14th, Valentine's Day. Harold almost laughed at the irony. What do we need to do? Be prepared to testify. The Pemberton attorneys are bringing in Richard Ashford, a heavy hitter from New York, former prosecutor, ruthless in court, success rate of about 85%. He's going to argue that the vault's contents rightfully belong to the estate, that you were trespassing, that finder's law doesn't apply when you're on property illegally. He'll try to make you look like opportunistic squatters who stole from a dead man's legacy. We didn't steal anything, I know that. But we need to prove it. I need you ready to tell your story, to show the judge and the court who you really are, what you've been through, why you were there in the first place. Danny's voice softened. "It's going to be hard, Harold. You'll have to relive the worst parts. The eviction, the medical bills, the homelessness. All of it in public, under oath, while hostile lawyers try to trip you up and make you look bad." Harold looked across their small apartment to where Dorothy sat at the kitchen table, working on a jigsaw puzzle they'd bought at a thrift store. She was humming softly, lost in concentration, finding peace in fitting pieces together. The thought of putting her through a courtroom interrogation made him feel sick. "Whatever it takes," he said quietly. "We'll do whatever it takes." The courthouse was a granite fortress in downtown Ridgewood, built in 1912 when American architecture still aspired to intimidate through sheer mass and classical pretension. Harold and Dorothy climbed the wide stone steps on the morning of February 14th, flanked by Danny and 2 security guards he'd hired after receiving credible threats on social media. Photographers lined both sides of the steps, cameras clicking like mechanical insects, voices shouting questions that Harold didn't try to answer. Inside, the courtroom smelled like old wood and older laws, like justice that had been sitting in the same room so long it had gone stale. Judge Margaret Warren presided from a high bench, her gray hair pulled back severely, her black robe crisp and imposing. She looked like someone who had heard every excuse, every sob story, every legal argument. and had long since learned to filter truth from fiction, genuine suffering from performance. The gallery was packed. News media filled the back rows. Curious citizens occupied the middle sections. In the front row on the left sat three well-dressed individuals who Harold assumed were the Pemberton claimants, great-grandchildren and distant relatives who probably hadn't thought about their ancestor in decades until $200 million appeared. Richard Ashford was exactly as Danny had described him. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit tailored to perfection. The kind of confidence that came from never having been truly hungry or cold or desperate. He stood at the plaintiff's table, arranging papers with the casual authority of someone who expected to win because he always won. Judge Warren gavelled the hearing to order. This is a claim dispute regarding property discovered by the defendants, Harold and Dorothy Jennings, on or about November 23rd of last year. The plaintiffs, representing the estate of James Robert Pemberton, contest the defendant's claim of finder's rights. Mr. Ashford, you may present your opening argument. Ashford stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of rightful inheritance and property law. James Robert Pemberton was a legitimate businessman who accumulated significant wealth through legal means over the course of his life. When he died in 1953, his estate was divided among his children and grandchildren according to his will. While some assets may have been misplaced, mislaid, or unaccounted for over the intervening decades, they remained the legal property of his heirs. He turned to gesture at Harold and Dorothy with barely concealed contempt. These defendants discovered what amounts to misplaced property while illegally trespassing on land they did not own and had no right to occupy. They cannot claim finder's rights when they were committing a criminal act at the time of discovery. Furthermore, the doctrine of treasure trove clearly states that deliberately hidden property belongs to the estate of the person who hid it, not to whoever happens to stumble across it decades later. My clients are the rightful heirs. The property belongs to them. Danny rose for his opening statement, his voice calmer, but no less forceful. Your Honor, with respect to my colleague, he is fundamentally mischaracterizing both the facts and the law. Mr. Pemberton deliberately hid these assets in a sealed vault with explicit written instructions that they be found by someone who needed them. He didn't want his heirs to have this money. He stated so clearly in a note he left with the vault. This isn't about misplaced property or legal technicalities. This is about honoring a man's final wishes. Wishes he made because he understood something that has been lost in this discussion. That money without humanity is worthless. And that sometimes the people who need help most are the ones society has decided don't matter. Judge Warren looked tired already, and they'd barely started. Let's hear testimony. Mr. Ashford, call your first witness. The plaintiff's case took most of the morning. Ashford called genealogists who traced the Pemberton family tree, establishing that his clients were indeed descendants. He called a property law expert who testified about treasure trove doctrine and the rights of heirs to inherited assets. He called a handwriting analyst who confirmed that the note in the vault was probably written by Pemberton, but suggested it might have been written under duress or diminished mental capacity. When Danny cross-examined, he focused on one key point. Can you definitively say that Mr. Pemberton was not of sound mind when he wrote that note? No, the analyst admitted, but the shakiness of the handwriting suggests he was elderly, which he was, 78 years old when he wrote it. But elderly is not the same as incompetent, is it? No, sir. After lunch, Danny called Harold to the stand. Harold walked to the witness box on legs that felt like they might give out. He was sworn in, his hand shaking on the Bible, and sat down in the hard wooden chair, every eye in the courtroom fixed on him. The weight of all that attention felt physical, crushing. Danny approached gently, giving Harold a small nod of encouragement. "Mr. Jennings, can you please tell the court how you came to be living in the industrial district of Ridgewood?" So Harold told his story. He spoke slowly, carefully, determined not to break down even though every word felt like reopening an old wound. He described his construction career. 40-plus years of honest work, building homes and offices and schools. He described Dorothy's cleaning job, her dedication, her pride in doing even menial work well. He told the court about his knees giving out, about being let go at 73 because younger workers were faster and cheaper, about Dorothy losing her job to automation, about the medical bills from her heart surgery that bankrupted them in 6 months. "We had savings," Harold said, his voice cracking slightly. 47 years of marriage, and we'd saved every penny we could. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was ours. It was supposed to be enough for retirement, for emergencies, but it wasn't enough for a triple bypass surgery and 6 months of recovery. That took everything. "What happened after the savings ran out?" Danny asked. "We got evicted. Couldn't pay triple the rent the new landlord wanted. Tried to find another place, but we couldn't afford anything. Shelters were full. Family either couldn't help or wouldn't. So we ended up on the street. That's Drive now 7 times 517. How long were you homeless?" 8 months. From March to November. "Where did you sleep?" Harold looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused from decades of labor. "First we slept in our car until someone stole it. Then under a bridge until the police ran us off. Then in doorways until business owners called the cops on us. Finally, we found that drainage tunnel, bought some plastic sheeting from a hardware store, and built a shelter. It wasn't much, just plastic wrap stretched over some boards, but it kept the rain off mostly." "And why did you start digging?" "Winter was coming. The plastic wasn't enough to protect us from real cold. I'd seen other homeless people freeze to death. I wasn't going to let that happen to Dorothy." His voice turned fierce. "I've been with that woman for 52 years. I've loved her every single day, and I wasn't going to watch her die of exposure because I was too tired or too broken to dig a hole." Danny let that sit for a moment. "What did you think when you found the hatch?" "I thought maybe it was an old root cellar. Maybe a storm shelter. At best, I thought we might find some dry space to sleep. I never imagined, I couldn't have imagined, what was actually down there." "And when you realized what you'd found," Harold looked directly at Judge Warren. "I thought maybe we'd finally caught a break. After everything we'd lost, after months of sleeping on cardboard and eating from soup kitchens, after being invisible to everyone who walked past us like we were garbage, I thought maybe the universe decided we'd suffered enough." Danny nodded slowly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Ashford stood for cross-examination, and his demeanor changed immediately. Gone was the polite professional. Now he moved like a predator who'd spotted weakness. "Mr. Jennings, you stated you were homeless for 8 months. Were you receiving any government assistance during that time?" "We tried. Applications got lost. Waiting lists were years long. But you didn't pursue it aggressively. We were busy trying to survive. Isn't it true that there are numerous resources for homeless individuals in this county? Shelters, food banks, job placement services, Harold felt anger rising in his chest. We used every resource we could find. We stood in line at food banks. We went to the community center for free meals. The shelters were full. The job placement services don't hire 73-year-old men with bad knees. So you decided to squat on property you didn't own instead of continuing to seek legitimate help. We were trying not to freeze to death. Did you have permission to be on that property? No. Did you attempt to find out who owned it and request permission? We were homeless, Mr. Ashford. We didn't have internet access or money to hire property lawyers. We found an abandoned piece of land, and we tried to survive on it. Ashford smiled coldly. And in the process of illegally occupying that land, you conveniently discovered $200 million. Danny shot to his feet. Objection. Counsel is implying facts, not in evidence. Sustained, Judge Warren said. Mr. Ashford, please stick to questions. But the damage was done. The implication hung in the air. Too convenient, too lucky, too suspicious. Dorothy testified next. And watching her walk to the stand was one of the hardest things Harold had ever done. She looked so small up there, so vulnerable in her thrift store dress and discount shoes. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Danny took her through their marriage, their long years of work, the medical crisis that destroyed them financially. Dorothy described the eviction with painful detail. The moment the sheriff had knocked on their door and given them 2 hours to pack. I'd lived in that apartment for 15 years, she said quietly. I knew every crack in the ceiling, every stain on the carpet. It was home, and then it wasn't. How did it feel to become homeless? Danny asked. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Like I'd disappeared. Like I wasn't a person anymore. People looked right through me. Or they looked at me with disgust. Like I was something dirty that shouldn't be there. I wanted to tell them I used to have a job. I used to volunteer at church. I used to be someone who mattered. But they didn't want to hear it. What kept you going? She looked at Harold in the gallery. Him. We had each other. As long as we were together, we could survive anything. When Ashford cross-examined her, he was no gentler. Mrs. Jennings, isn't it true that you had family who offered assistance? My sister said she'd help but then stopped returning calls. Because you asked for too much. Dorothy's eyes flashed with rare anger. Because she didn't want the burden. People think they'll help until they realize what help actually costs. Your stepson sent you money, didn't he? $200. Once. With a note saying not to contact him again. But that was help. Financial assistance, which you claimed you didn't receive. $200 doesn't pay for much, Mr. Ashford. Not when you need housing and food and medicine. Yet it's more than many people give. Doesn't that suggest that perhaps your family found you difficult to help? That perhaps your situation was partly of your own making? Dorothy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But it carried through the silent courtroom with devastating clarity. You think we chose this? You think we wanted to sleep under plastic wrap and beg for change and be filmed by teenagers who laughed at our suffering? You think anyone chooses to be invisible? She looked directly at Ashford. We did everything right. We worked our whole lives. We saved what we could. We were good people. And the world broke us anyway. Not because we made bad choices. Because we got old and sick and poor. And nobody cares about people like that. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Ashford seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Warren called for a recess. And when they reconvened, Danny made his closing argument. Your Honor, I'd like to read one line from James Robert Pemberton's note. If you are desperate enough to dig this deep, then perhaps you need this more than my children ever will." He knew what he was doing. He knew his heirs were wealthy, that they'd inherited millions from his documented estate, and he chose, deliberately and consciously, to leave this vault for someone else, someone who had nothing, someone who would understand what he had learned too late in his own life, that all the money in the world means nothing if you've lost your humanity, if you've lost the ability to see suffering and respond to it with compassion. Danny turned to face the gallery. Harold and Dorothy Jennings aren't perfect people. They're not saints. They're just two human beings who survived the worst that life could throw at them and still managed to hold onto their dignity and their love for each other. Mr. Pemberton left his fortune for people exactly like them. People who've been forgotten. People who've been judged and dismissed and treated as if they don't matter. If anyone deserves to benefit from James Robert Pemberton's final act of generosity, it's them. It's them. Ashford's closing was predictably aggressive. He argued law and precedent, inheritance rights and property doctrine. He painted Harold and Dorothy as opportunistic trespassers who got lucky and now wanted to profit from their illegal activity. "We cannot allow people to benefit from breaking the law," he concluded, no matter how sympathetic their circumstances might appear. Judge Warren announced she would take the matter under advisement and deliver her ruling in 30 days. 30 days to decide whether 8 months of homelessness would end in salvation or continued suffering. Those 30 days were the longest of Harold's life. He and Dorothy existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to plan, unable to dream, unable to do anything but wait. They spent the time walking through Ridgewood, revisiting places from their previous life. The apartment building where they'd once lived, now renovated and unrecognizable. The diner where Dorothy had worked for 5 years, now a trendy coffee shop. The church where they'd gotten married 52 years ago, still standing, still holding services they no longer attended. One cold afternoon in early March, they found themselves back at the industrial district. The drainage tunnel was sealed now, marked with police tape and a historical site designation, but they stood together looking at it, remembering. "Whatever happens," Dorothy said, her breath visible in the cold air, "we survived that. We survived being homeless. We survived winter. We survived losing everything. Even if the judge takes it all away, we already won." Harold pulled her close. "We did. We absolutely did." But deep down, he still hoped. He hoped Judge Warren would see what he saw. That this wasn't about money or inheritance law or legal technicalities. This was about a gift left by a man who had learned, too late in his own life, what actually mattered. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe delivered justice to those who needed it most. On March 16th, they returned to the courthouse. The gallery was even more packed than before, the media presence overwhelming. Judge Warren entered, and everyone stood. That ritual show of respect for judicial authority. When she sat, everyone else followed. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this matter," Judge Warren began, her voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "This case raises complex legal questions about property rights, inheritance law, and the doctrine of treasure trove. But at its core, this case is about something simpler: intent." She looked directly at Harold and Dorothy. James Robert Pemberton left explicit, written instructions about his wishes for this vault and its contents. He stated clearly that he wanted it found by someone desperate enough to dig for it, someone who needed it more than his own children and grandchildren. The historical record shows that Mr. Pemberton's heirs inherited substantial wealth from his documented estate. They were not deprived of their rightful inheritance. The vault was deliberately hidden with instructions that it remain so until discovered by someone in genuine need. Ashford began to rise. Judge Warren held up her hand. The defendants found this vault while seeking shelter on land that had been legally abandoned for nearly 50 years. They immediately sought legal counsel rather than attempting to conceal or misappropriate the contents. They have cooperated fully with all investigations. And most importantly, they meet the exact criteria Mr. Pemberton specified in his note. They were desperate. They dug deep, and they needed help. She paused. And in that pause, Harold felt his entire life balancing on a knife's edge. Dorothy gripped his hand so tightly he thought bones might break. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the contents of the Pemberton vault, after payment of all applicable taxes and legal fees, are the lawful property of Harold and Dorothy Jennings as finders of abandoned property. The plaintiff's claims are denied. The gavel fell. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others shouted in protest. Reporters were already typing on their phones, racing to break the news. Ashford was on his feet arguing for appeal, but his words were lost in the chaos. Dorothy collapsed against Harold, sobbing so hard her entire body shook. He held her, his own eyes burning, unable to speak, because if he opened his mouth he would break completely. They'd won. Against all odds, against wealthy opponents, with expensive lawyers, against a legal system that rarely favored people like them, they'd won. Danny gripped Harold's shoulder, his professional composure cracking into a genuine smile. Congratulations, you're officially rich. But as they left the courthouse through a back exit, escaping the media circus out front, Harold felt something strange. Not joy exactly, not relief, something quieter and deeper. A sense that the hard part wasn't over, it was just beginning. Because money, as James Robert Pemberton had learned too late, came with its own kind of weight, its own burdens, its own tests of character. They'd survived homelessness. They'd survived winter. They'd survived a legal battle that could have destroyed them. Now they'd have to survive wealth. And Harold wondered, driving away from the courthouse with Dorothy's hand in his, if that might be the hardest test of all. The money didn't come immediately. It never does. The legal system moves with the speed of continental drift, grinding through processes and procedures with methodical indifference to human urgency. After Judge Warren's ruling, there were appeals to file and deny, appeals that Ashford pursued with the determination of someone who couldn't accept losing. Those took 6 weeks. Then came the authentication process. Each item in the vault examined by experts, photographed, catalogued, appraised. The old currency had to be verified as genuine. The gold coins needed certification. The bearer bonds required validation that the issuing institutions would honor decades-old instruments. The IRS descended with the enthusiasm of archaeologists discovering a pharaoh's tomb. They wanted documentation on everything: proof of discovery, chain of custody, independent appraisals from multiple sources. They calculated values, recalculated, argued over market rates versus face values, debated whether collector premiums applied to found currency. Harold and Dorothy signed more forms than they knew existed, their signatures appearing on documents they barely understood, trusting Danny to guide them through the labyrinth of financial and legal requirements. 4 months after the court ruling, the process was finally complete. Harold sat in Danny's office, staring at a statement that seemed like it belonged to someone else. Some fictional character in a story about people who won lotteries or discovered treasures. The number at the bottom refused to make sense no matter how many times he read it. $143,762,418.37. That's after federal and state taxes, Danny explained, though Harold had stopped listening to explanations weeks ago. After legal fees, authentication costs, storage fees, and all other expenses, this is what's left. This is yours. Dorothy sat beside Harold, holding the same statement with shaking hands. All of it? She whispered. This is all ours? Every penny, Danny confirmed. The accounts are established. The transfers are complete. You can access it whenever you want. You can do whatever you want with it. That was the question that had kept Harold awake for 4 months. What do we want? Not what could they buy, or where could they live, or what luxuries could they afford, but fundamentally, at their core, what did they actually want? They spent 3 days in their modest apartment, barely speaking, each lost in thought. Harold would start to say something, then stop. Dorothy would look like she wanted to suggest something, then shake her head. The weight of decision paralyzed them. $143 million represented choices they'd never had to make before, possibilities they'd never imagined, a future they couldn't yet envision. On the 4th day, Dorothy made coffee and sat Harold down at their small kitchen table. "We need to talk about this," she said firmly. "We can't keep avoiding it." "I know. What do you want, Harold? Really want?" He thought about it. Really thought about it. "I want you to be safe. I want you to never worry about medical bills or rent, or whether we'll eat tomorrow. I want to know that if something happens to me, you'll be taken care of." He paused. "And I want to help people. The ones still out there, sleeping in cars and under bridges. The ones who are where we were." Dorothy nodded slowly. "I want the same things, but Harold, we can't save everyone. We can't fix all the suffering in the world." "No," he agreed. "But we can fix some of it. And that's better than fixing none of it." They started small, testing the water of generosity like people learning to swim. Harold's first act was to anonymously pay off medical debts for everyone who had been in Dorothy's cardiac unit at Ridgewood General Hospital. He worked with the hospital's billing department, providing funds to cover outstanding balances for 37 families who were struggling under the weight of healthcare costs. $3 million gone in a day. The hospital sent letters to each family. "Your medical debt has been forgiven by an anonymous donor. You owe nothing." This is not a mistake. Harold and Dorothy never met any of those families, never knew their names, never received thanks, and that was exactly how they wanted it. Next came the homeless shelters. Dorothy researched every shelter within 50 miles of Ridgewood, catalogued their capacities, their seasonal operations, their funding shortfalls. Then she wrote checks. Big checks. Checks that ensured year-round operations, expanded bed counts, hired additional staff, improved facilities. $2 million distributed across 8 organizations. No press releases. No naming opportunities. Just money appearing where it was needed most. Allowing shelters to stop turning people away. To operate through summer when funding typically dried up. To serve every person who came to their doors. The work felt good. It felt right. Each act of giving created space in Harold's chest, where fear and bitterness had lived for so long. He was lighter somehow. Freer, as if he'd been carrying the weight of that money as burden and was finally able to set it down. But Dorothy wanted something bigger. Something permanent. "We should build something," she said one evening as they sat on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the sun set over Ridgewood. Something that lasts, so people remember not just the money but what it meant. Like what? She was quiet for a long moment. I want to buy the industrial district, the place where we survived. I want to turn it into something beautiful, something that helps people. Harold looked at his wife, at the fierce determination in her 71-year-old eyes, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride in this woman, who had survived homelessness and emerged not broken, but purposeful. Then let's do it, he said. They purchased the 47-acre industrial site for $800,000, a price that would have been impossible 8 months ago, but now felt almost trivial. The abandoned water treatment plant, the crumbling warehouses, the forgotten drainage tunnel where they'd built their plastic shelter, all of it became theirs, and immediately they began to transform it. Harold hired architects, not the fancy downtown firms but young, hungry designers who understood what they were trying to create. Not luxury, not showpieces, but functional, dignified spaces where people could rebuild their lives. They designed permanent supportive housing, 150 small apartments with case management offices, a medical clinic, a community kitchen, job training spaces, and recreational areas. Each apartment was modest but complete, a place where someone transitioning from homelessness could learn to live independently again while still having support. Dorothy worked with social workers to ensure the services matched the need. Mental health counseling, addiction treatment, legal aid, job placement assistance, computer training. All of it free, all of it designed to address not just the symptoms of homelessness but the underlying causes. They kept the drainage tunnel itself, the place where they'd survived winter. It became a memorial, preserved exactly as it had been, with the plastic shelter reconstructed and protected under a glass enclosure. A bronze plaque told their story in simple language. In this place, 2 souls survived the winter of their lives. What they found beneath the frozen earth was not just money, but purpose. May all who visit remember that dignity is not something others grant us. It is something we carry within, even in our darkest hours. The project took 18 months to complete and cost $28 million. They called it Pemberton Place, honoring the man whose gift had made it all possible. The grand opening was scheduled for a warm day in early September, 3 years after Harold had first struck his shovel against that wooden hatch. 500 people attended the ribbon cutting. Social workers, formerly homeless residents who'd moved into the apartments, city officials who'd initially been skeptical, news crews who'd covered the story from the beginning. But the keynote speaker wasn't Harold or Dorothy. They'd insisted on that. Instead, a young woman named Sarah stood at the podium, her 2 children beside her, both scrubbed clean and wearing new school clothes. 6 months ago, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly, I was living in my car with my babies. We bathed in gas station bathrooms. We ate whatever I could afford from dollar stores. I told them every night that everything was going to be okay. But I stopped believing my own words. I thought we'd be invisible forever, that nobody cared whether we lived or died. She paused, wiping her eyes. Then someone told me about this place, about apartments for people like me, about help without judgment, about a chance to start over. And now we have a home. My kids are enrolled in school. I'm working again. We're not invisible anymore. She looked directly at Harold and Dorothy, standing in the back of the crowd. I don't know what makes someone give away millions to help strangers. But I know that whoever did this, whoever built this place. They saw us when everyone else looked away. And that matters more than any amount of money." The crowd applauded. Harold felt tears streaming down his face, unashamed. Dorothy gripped his hand so tightly it hurt, but he didn't care. This moment of watching someone else's life change because they'd had the courage to share what they'd been given, this was what wealth actually meant. But they weren't finished. With Danny's help, they established the Pemberton Foundation with an initial endowment of $30 million. The foundation's mission was simple: fund projects that helped people transitioning out of homelessness in small cities across Pennsylvania. Not big, glamorous programs in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh that already attracted donor attention, but quiet projects in places like Ridgewood that nobody noticed or cared about. Over the next 2 years, the foundation funded 23 similar housing projects, 34 shelter expansions, and countless smaller initiatives. They paid off medical school loans for 42 doctors who agreed to practice in underserved communities for at least 5 years. They bought a failing grocery store in a food desert neighborhood and converted it into a worker-owned cooperative, ensuring fresh food access and creating jobs simultaneously. They funded trade school scholarships for 200 students who couldn't afford traditional education. They did good, quietly and consistently, without press releases or naming opportunities or demands for recognition. And they lived simply. They bought a house, modest by any standard, certainly modest by the standards of people worth over $100 million. It was a 3-bedroom ranch on the edge of town with a small yard and a porch. They paid cash, $175,000. Dorothy planted a garden where she grew tomatoes and peppers and herbs. Harold built a workshop in the garage where he fixed things for neighbors who couldn't afford repair bills, refusing payment, finding joy in using his skills to help rather than to survive. They bought a used Ford F-150 truck, 8 years old with 90,000 miles on it, and drove it to the regular grocery store where they bought regular groceries and used coupons like everyone else. People who recognized them from the news coverage were often confused. "Why aren't you living in a mansion?" someone asked Harold at the hardware store one Saturday. He considered the question while examining different grades of sandpaper. "Because we don't need a mansion. We just needed enough. And it turns out, enough is a lot less than most people think." They kept approximately $5 million for themselves, invested conservatively to generate income for the rest of their lives. It was more money than they'd ever need, more than they could spend if they tried. The rest, nearly $140 million, they gave away over the course of 3 years. Not recklessly or carelessly, but thoughtfully, strategically, to causes and organizations and people who needed it most. The financial advisors they'd hired were horrified. "You're making a mistake," one told them. "You could live like royalty. You could travel the world. You could have anything you want." "We have what we want," Dorothy replied simply. "Each other, a home, purpose. What else is there?" 3 years after finding the vault, a reporter named Jennifer Chen requested an interview. She'd covered their story from the beginning, had been fair and honest when other journalists sensationalized or criticized. Harold and Dorothy agreed, but on one condition: the interview would happen at Pemberton Place. They met in the community room on a Thursday evening. Residents were gathering for dinner, the smell of home-cooked food filling the air. Children ran through the halls. Adults chatted in the common areas. The place hummed with life and possibility. Jennifer set up her recording equipment and sat across from Harold and Dorothy at a simple table. "I'll get right to it," she said. "People want to know how it feels to go from homeless to millionaires." Dorothy smiled gently. "We're not millionaires anymore. We gave most of it away." Jennifer's eyes widened. "You… what?" Harold explained, patiently. "They'd kept enough to live comfortably, to never worry about medical bills or rent again. About $5 million, invested to generate modest annual income. Everything else had gone to the foundation, to direct aid, to building things that would outlast them." "But that was your chance," Jennifer said, struggling to understand. "Your chance to live however you wanted. Vacation homes, luxury cars, never working another day. Most people dream of that kind of freedom." "We tried that," Dorothy said. "For about a week after we got the money. We stayed in 5-star hotels, ate at expensive restaurants, bought designer clothes that felt uncomfortable and foreign on our bodies. You know what it felt like? What? Lonely. Empty. Like wearing someone else's skin. Those things weren't earned by getting rich. They were earned by surviving, by sleeping under plastic wrap, and still choosing to love each other, by maintaining dignity when the world told us we were worthless. That's what taught us what matters, which is," Harold took Dorothy's hand, "each other, purpose, making sure nobody else has to live the way we lived because society decided they don't matter. You can't buy that with money. You can only build it with choices." The interview went viral. Not like the initial story had, but in a different way. People shared it with comments about being inspired, about rethinking their own priorities, about realizing that maybe happiness didn't come from accumulation, but from contribution. Other wealthy people, not many but some, started their own foundations or funded similar projects. The ripple effect of Harold and Dorothy's choices spread further than any single act of generosity could have. But not everyone approved. Online critics called them foolish. Financial experts calculated how much money they'd wasted, how much they could have made through smart investments. Some accused them of virtue signaling or claimed the whole thing was an elaborate tax dodge. Others simply couldn't understand why anyone would give away a fortune when they could keep it. Harold and Dorothy didn't respond to any of it. They were too busy living their lives, tending Dorothy's garden, fixing broken lawnmowers in Harold's workshop, volunteering at Pemberton Place twice a week to have dinner with residents and hear their stories. On their 57th wedding anniversary, they returned to the Drainage Tunnel Memorial. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the site nearly empty. They stood together in front of the glass enclosure that protected their old plastic shelter, looking at the place where they dug in desperation and found salvation. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked quietly. "Giving so much away. 17 U7s, giving so much away." Harold thought about the question seriously. He thought about the house they'd lost on Maple Street, about the years of poverty and struggle, about 8 months sleeping under plastic, about finding a vault full of money and the choice that followed. He thought about Sarah and her children, about the 42 doctors serving rural communities, about the 200 students learning trades, about the hundreds of people who'd found shelter because 2 homeless souls had decided to share their unexpected fortune. "No," he said finally, "we kept the only thing that mattered. We kept each other. We kept our humanity. Everything else was just a tool to build something better than we found." Dorothy leaned against him, and they stood in comfortable silence. After 57 years of marriage, they'd learned that some truths didn't need words. They could communicate in the quiet spaces between breaths, in the gentle pressure of hands held, in the simple fact of presence. Behind them, Pemberton Place buzzed with activity. The medical clinic was seeing patients. The job training center was running classes. The community kitchen was preparing dinner for 150 people who 6 months ago might have been sleeping in cars or under bridges. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter carrying on the autumn wind. It was everything Harold and Dorothy had imagined and more. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, residents started gathering for the evening meal. Harold and Dorothy joined them, not as benefactors or donors, but as friends, as people who understood what it meant to be hungry and cold and invisible. They sat at a long table, sharing food and stories, and for a moment it was hard to tell who had been homeless and who hadn't, who had money and who didn't. They were just people, breaking bread together, finding community in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. Later that night, back in their modest house with its small garden and porch swing, Harold and Dorothy sat together watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Dorothy's head rested on Harold's shoulder. His arm was wrapped around her. They didn't need to speak. After 57 years, silence was its own language. Harold thought about James Robert Pemberton, the steel baron who'd hidden a fortune and left it for someone desperate enough to dig. He thought about that note, those words about using it wisely, about building something that mattered. And he wondered if somewhere, across the vast distance between life and death, Pemberton knew what his gift had become. If he understood that 2 homeless people had taken his money and transformed it into hope, had multiplied his single act of generosity into thousands of changed lives. "Thank you," Harold whispered into the darkness, not sure if he was speaking to Pemberton or to God or to the universe itself. "Thank you for trusting us with this. I hope we did it right." Dorothy stirred slightly. "We did," she murmured, without opening her eyes. "We absolutely did." And in that moment, sitting on a porch that cost less than 0.1% of what they'd found, Harold understood something profound. Wealth wasn't measured in dollars or properties or investment portfolios. It was measured in the lives you touched, the suffering you eased, the hope you created in places where hope had died. By that measure, he and Dorothy were the richest people in Pennsylvania, maybe in the entire country. They had survived winter beneath plastic wrap and emerged not just with money, but with wisdom that money could never buy. They had learned that we are all connected, that suffering demands response, that the greatest fortunes are the ones we give away. And they had proven that sometimes the people society forgets are the ones who remember best what it means to be human. As the last light faded from the sky and stars filled the darkness above, Harold closed his eyes and let himself feel gratitude, not for the money, though that had certainly helped, but for Dorothy, for 57 years of partnership, for the chance to turn their pain into purpose, for the opportunity to ensure that their suffering mattered, that it led to something larger than themselves. Money had given them options, but love, dignity, and compassion had given them direction. And in the end, direction mattered more than destination. The journey mattered more than the arrival. The building mattered more than what you built. They had been homeless, invisible, forgotten, and they had found $230 million buried beneath a drainage tunnel. But the real treasure wasn't the money. It was never the money. The real treasure was the choice they made after finding it. The decision to share rather than hoard, to build rather than consume, to remember where they came from rather than pretend they'd always been comfortable. Because true wealth, Harold realized as sleep began to claim him, wasn't something you kept in a vault or a bank account. It was something you carried in your heart, something you shared with others, something that grew every time you chose compassion over comfort and community over convenience. They had been poor, they had been rich, and they had learned that neither poverty nor wealth defined them. What defined them was how they treated others, how they responded to suffering, how they chose to live when given more than they needed. And they had chosen well. In the darkness of their small bedroom, in a modest house on the edge of town, two people who had lost everything and found it again slept the sleep of those who know they've lived well. Not perfectly, not without mistakes or regrets, but well, meaningfully, with purpose and love and a fierce commitment to making the world slightly better than they'd found it. And in the morning, they would wake and tend the garden, and fix broken things in the workshop, and have dinner with residents at Pemberton Place. They would live simply and give generously, and remember always that the greatest privilege in life isn't what you have but what you're able to share. Because in the end, Harold and Dorothy Jennings had discovered a truth more valuable than any vault full of money. That the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away. That dignity comes from within, not from circumstances. That love is the only wealth that matters, and that sometimes the people who've had nothing are the ones who understand best how to share everything. The story of Harold and Dorothy Jennings teaches us that redemption isn't always about what we gain, but about what we choose to do with unexpected blessings when they arrive. Two people who society had completely discarded became architects of hope, proving that the size of your bank account matters far less than the size of your heart. Because anyone can stumble upon treasure, but it takes true character to transform that treasure into legacy, to build something that matters more than mansions or sports cars or luxury vacations, to choose purpose over possessions and community over comfort. For Harold and Dorothy, and for the thousands of lives they touched with their choices, the real fortune was never the money buried beneath that drainage tunnel. It was the love that survived 8 months of winter sleeping under plastic wrap. It was the dignity that endured homelessness and hunger, and being treated as invisible. It was the compassion that chose to remember suffering and respond to it, not with bitterness, but with generosity. It was the wisdom that understood wealth is only meaningful when it's shared, that comfort is only valuable when others are lifted up alongside you, that success is empty unless it creates space for others to succeed. They had dug in desperation, looking for warmth to survive one more season. Instead, they found something far more valuable. They found purpose. They found a way to transform their pain into progress, their suffering into service, their broken past into a foundation for other people's futures. And in doing so, they proved that the truest measure of wealth has nothing to do with what you own, and everything to do with what you give away. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will move you. Click now to keep exploring with us, and hit subscribe if you believe kindness is the truest form of wealth.